denied all allegations of non-consensual sexual contact.
Harvey Weinstein.
Weinstein is also the focus of sex crimes
And yet
investigations here in
another
LA.
Me Too moment of reckoning.
Be in his circle was to be successful.
Police let him out of a Manhattan precinct in handcuffs.
Welcome to Unshut Cases. On today's episode, we have Carol Murchison, who is of counsel at McAllister Oliverius, headquartered in London and New York. Carol, thank you so much today for joining Unshut Cases. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. And I'm Dan Taft, the host of Unshut Cases. We're kind of diving into a very interesting set of cases here today. We're kind of calling this the People versus Harvey Weinstein because there's multiple ongoing cases. There was Hewitt versus the Weinstein Company. Just in January, a massage therapist sued MSG, Madison Square Garden chief executive James Dolan, and Harvey Weinstein, accusing them of sex trafficking and sexual assault. That's just a few months ago. And you actually have very unique lens into all of this because you've been called the cult assassin for taking down cults. You headed up cases involving sexual misconduct in religious and faith-based spiritual communities, worked to uncover sexual misconduct with the Shambhala International Lineage of Buddhism, the Shivananda Yoga Vedanta Centers, and you've just conducted so many of these workplace investigations, taught investigative techniques to human resource professionals at a bunch of Fortune 500 companies. So we're excited to have you here. Obviously, you're going to be able to kind of dig into all of this in a way that is unique, and you have a long track record of expertise here. Can you kind of start, let's talk about just how you became involved with this specific one, because obviously the Harvey Weinstein trials kind of grew out of the Me Too movement when, you know, a bunch of high profile celebrities and Hollywood executives and people like that started getting exposed.
Sexual misconduct against Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein led to the Me Too movement.
So during Harvey Weinstein's initial criminal proceedings in the early 2020s, just a few years ago, you'd actually reached out to the lawyers representing the women accusing him, making an argument for why he should be charged with human trafficking despite not crossing state lines, because human trafficking law works differently than most people think, and a phone call or something like that across state lines could hypothetically, or, you know, you can dig into it more, actually be human trafficking. So can you tell us about that, how you got involved there, and kind of the, you know, initial moments and days and weeks where you were doing some of this work?
Harassment in the workplace, sexual misconduct in the workplace. And I was a person who did a lot of investigations. So I would come in from the outside. I would be an outside counsel. I would investigate and then help them to understand what they had to do under the law. Ultimately, I retired and still continued to do investigations. And then in 2018, 2019, a woman, I just fell into correspondence with a woman who was alleging that there was a lot of sexual misconduct in the Shambhala community in Halifax, in Canada. They had previously been in Boulder, Colorado. And I told her what I knew, which was that if this happened in corporate America, they would do an investigation. And that's what she needed to ask them to do. But she told me that they were no longer speaking to her. They were not willing to do an investigation. So I somewhat naively, I suppose, offered to do just look into what she had and to see if there was indeed sexual misconduct there. And then shortly after that began to come forward, and they alleged that the head of the Shambhala organization had been sexually assaulting women.
The stories making headlines this Monday morning across our state. A 64-page report describing two credible allegations of sexual misconduct against a former Boulder spiritual leader, Sakyong Mifam Rinpoche. According to the Denver Post, a Canadian law firm conducted that investigation, which found the spiritual leader abused his power. The leader of the Buddhist community stepped aside from his role as head of Shambhala last July after these allegations surfaced, and he did write a letter to followers acknowledging how his past relationships caused harm. According to a Shambhala spokesperson, Rinpoche is expected to make a public statement in the coming days.
After that received a lot of media, there were a lot of women who came forward, and this ties in, I think, Dan, to what you said, which is this was the era of the Me Too movement, those years after 2018. Women came forward and they were saying about Harvey Weinstein and other workplaces, me too. They were saying, me too. This happened to me in my spiritual community. And I didn't know what it was. And so then I began doing more investigations, trying to get organizations that were spiritual, religious, faith-based to take accountability, to hold themselves accountable for what was happening. And I can tell you that I spent probably 4 years doing that. And generally speaking, I would say I failed because none of these organizations were willing to hold themselves accountable. And so I realized that the only tool that I had left, I tried media, I tried meeting with boards, I tried teaching the law to people so that they would understand. But finally, I realized that the law is the ultimate hammer. And if you use the law, then that is what you had to do. So then I began representing women who were willing to bring and able to bring, because it's not easy. We have very restrictive statutes of limitations in some of these states. And so it's not easy to have a pathway to the courthouse. But that's what I began doing. And I began doing it with Anne Oliverius, who, as you said, has an office in London and in New York and has been a long time fierce fighter for women's rights. So it felt like a good home to put this particular practice.
Just kind of dovetailing or circling back to some of the more recent Harvey Weinstein stuff and kind of how these things connect. This recent case that came up in January, which was the one where the massage therapist sued Dolan and Weinstein. The allegations say that Dolan brought Kelly Croft, who was a 27-year-old working as a licensed massage therapist, to Los Angeles to engage in unlawful and unwelcome sex acts with her. And then the federal lawsuit also alleges that Harvey Weinstein sexually assaulted Croft with Dolan's knowledge. Obviously, this is new or relatively new information, again, because a lot of these initial allegations came out 4, 5, 6 years ago at this point. When you first heard about the allegations against Harvey Weinstein, what were kind of your first thoughts there, and how was that coming up in your day-to-day conversations and your work with what you were doing?
Well, I think it was, first of all, my surprise at the what is called the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is a federal law. So it's available in any state. In this case, in the initial Harvey Weinstein cases in New York. And my initial surprise was to see Harvey Weinstein's name associated with the human trafficking law. I could see assault. I could see, sexual assault, a lot of different things like that, rape, whatever. But I was surprised at the trafficking part of it because I had never worked with the Trafficking Act before. It said to me, and I'll bet it does as well to a lot of your listeners, that you have to cross a state line.
Yeah.
We're thinking of human trafficking, by the way, consists of two elements. One is sex, for sex, and the other is for forced labor. And so both of them very similar in that there is no requirement in the federal law that you cross state lines. The requirement is that you have some connection to interstate commerce. So the Interstate Commerce Act has had a long history of being used for unusual purposes. So, for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was based in the Interstate Commerce Act. And in this case, what they're saying is there has to be some connection to interstate commerce, but geez, it's hard these days with the internet, with cell phones, with kind of the kind of economy that we have, that you wouldn't have some connection to interstate commerce. So, for example, if you're a retreat center, which a lot of my cases involve retreat centers, sometimes Buddhist, sometimes yoga. If you're a retreat center and you advertise in different places, then you are in effect using the Interstate Commerce Act. And that's all that's required in trafficking. So after you get past that, Then I look at Harvey Weinstein cases, the first ones that came out after women first began to come forward, and I began to see the value of the Human Trafficking Act as it applied to cults and to certain kinds of what I would call high demand religious associations. So they might be Buddhist, they might be yoga, they could be anything. But the Trafficking Act is amazingly broad. And when Congress passed it, they said, we've passed it to be broad. We haven't wanted it to be narrow. So when courts are interpreting it, they are doing so, as Congress instructed them to do, quite broadly. So we could talk about what's required under the Human Trafficking Act, if that would be of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. That was my next question. So in this case, you absolutely thought there was a case for human trafficking to be made here, right? So what were specifically about what happened here? Can you speak to why you think this actually falls under those guidelines or falls under that legislation?
And do you mean for Harvey Weinstein or
Yeah.
Yes,
For the Harvey Weinstein one specifically.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's what you have. The basic thing about human trafficking, not the act, not to get too down into the weeds.
Sure. Mhm.
So the first thing to say about it is there's a criminal portion. And then I think in 2003, Congress expanded that to give a civil portion. So the criminal portion is you get convicted of this and you go to jail, right?
Yeah.
But the civil portion is if you are held liable, then you pay money.
Yeah.
And so those are the two differences. So in 2003, Congress said, okay, let's make a civil path for human trafficking. In 2008, they expanded again to say, let's allow beneficiaries of human trafficking to also be sued civilly in the courts. So now that's also very useful to the kinds of plaintiffs that I have, because there's always some organization that is benefiting from the trafficking, and that means they can be sued as well. So what do you need to make a claim under the Trafficking Act? In kind of short form, you have to have some connection to interstate commerce, and there has to be some coercion or fraud in what is called in the act a commercial sex act. But the commercial sex act does not have to be about money. It can be about something, anything of value.
Sure.
All right. So if we apply that to the Harvey Weinstein cases, the initial ones, the civil cases, what people were able to say is fraud and coercion. I had Harvey Weinstein coerced me into having sex with him, and or he fraudulently made promises to me. So in Harvey's case, that was women who were actresses to whom he said, have sex with me and I will get you an interview with a very famous producer and your career will be fabulous.
Quid pro quo, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
It's a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
And in that quid pro quo, there is no issue of consent. So this is important. We can go back to that. So we should put a pin in that.
Sure.
Consent is not an issue under the Human Trafficking Act. If you think about what I think about traditional human trafficking, women who are put in back of a van, they're taken across state lines, even international borders, and they are forced into sex labor. We don't ever say, is this consensual? Is each and every one of these acts consensual? It's simply not an issue. And that is why when I learned this, I thought, wow, this is really about the kind of work I was doing at that time in 2019, 2020. This is what happens in cults. Not necessarily fraud, but coercion. if you have sex with me, I will be able to give you better teachings. I will help you progress along the path. You will get to sit at a special table when we eat dinner because you will be like a teacher's pet, so to speak.
And now I present Heather Kerr. Okay. In 1989, I was working part-time for an entertainment business manager. One of his clients was Harvey Weinstein. Harvey called the office almost every day, and I would answer the phones. He would ask me questions about myself, and I would tell him that I was an actress, pursuing acting as a professional career. He offered to meet with me, and I asked my boss what he thought. He told me that I should definitely meet with Harvey because he could really help me out in the film industry. Harvey and I arranged a meeting. He told me that he was not working out of his regular office on that particular day and wanted me to meet him in an office in Westwood. I arrived, and a person who appeared to be a secretary was leaving. She gave me a look like, "I hope you're ready for this." It was unsettling.
Those are all potentially the kinds of quid pro quos that happen in cults and that the Human Trafficking Act sees
Yeah.
as a viable part of the law.
Okay. What are some kind of common misconceptions that people have when they think about human trafficking? You mentioned the one, obviously, of like putting someone in a van and driving them across. Obviously, that does happen. But to your point, in this case, it's a lot more gray, right? Or a lot more, not fuzzy, but there's kind of, to your point, they made the legislation broad, right? So it could cover these things. So kind of what are some things that people may not realize that are specific, like you just mentioned, that happen more often and could kind of fall into this category of human trafficking?
Yeah. So I think that there are a couple of things. One is, of course, the carrying people over state lines is human trafficking.
Yeah.
It happens more often than it should be happening,
Mhm.
but it's not the only way that you can check off the boxes of the Human Trafficking Act. Another misconception, I think, is that it requires what I think of as commercial sex acts equaling prostitution.
Right.
That is sex for money.
Right.
But it doesn't.
Right.
It's sex for anything of value.
Yeah.
And that is really spectacularly broad when you think about it. And so it has a lot of applications to
Yeah.
the world of cults.
And it feels like it's gonna, I know like the P. Diddy thing right now, a lot of stuff is coming out about that. It feels like some of that could potentially be involved in that case as well. How have the cases against Weinstein impacted workplace culture? Have you seen an effect across the board from some of this stuff?
Well, yes, so what I would say, Dan, is that I've seen, I've been around long enough to see two waves
Yeah.
of right? I would say that the first wave started in the 90s
Mm-hmm.
when we saw Anita Hill
Yep.
testify against Clarence Thomas in the hearings for his Supreme Court seat. And I was practicing law in Massachusetts then, and I recall somebody telling me that the Human Rights Agency in Massachusetts had never even had a case of harassment until that time. And their phones were ringing off the hook with people who said the same thing that we said in 2018, me too.
Right.
This happened to me too.
Mm-hmm.
And so we began to see, then there were a couple of Supreme Court cases that said that employers were going to be liable for this kind of activity in their workplace. And so we saw people who had businesses who had workplaces saying, let's train our people on what sexual harassment is, so we're not fighting these lawsuits. I saw that wave, and then that kind of died down.
Mhm.
But as you suggested, I think that rose up again. I certainly saw a huge increase in the number of workplace investigations that I was asked to do after Harvey Weinstein, where people were saying, you know what, we need to be more careful about this. We need to be investigating what's happening when these things come forward, and we need to be resolving them. So that when I got involved in doing investigations into spiritual and religious communities, high demand organizations. And by that, I mean where you usually have to take an oath of loyalty to the guru or
Yeah.
to the Swami. It's a high demand situation.
Yeah.
You do not have your own agency, which is of course a kind of a breeding ground for an abuse of power.
It's control.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so I began to see that, for example, when I was working with a lot of Buddhist investigations, I often said that Buddhist America was not doing as well as corporate America in policing and acting against gender violence, sexual violence in their organizations. And I would say, for the most part, many of those organizations did not wish to do that because they're in a bind,
Yeah.
because they also have that oath of loyalty to the Swami or to the guru. And so it's a very difficult situation for them to be in, which is why it seemed to me, at least, to be necessary to use the law to be able to get accountability.
Yeah, and you're kind of touching on something that I was going to ask about, which is in your own experience, obviously a lot of it has been with cults. How does this Weinstein case compare to the other workplace harassment or assault cases that you've worked on? I mean, what are kind of like some one-to-one parallels where you're seeing this is here and this was here?
Well, one, I think, is that many religious organizations, high demand religious organizations, don't believe that the law applies to them. So the thing about corporations in the United States is that they've probably invested billions of dollars into outside legal counsel, HR departments, their own legal departments, in order to avoid this kind of liability. When I look at some of the organizations that I have lawsuits against, they have had no interest whatsoever in that. It is actually, in some cases, I believe, and our allegations in the lawsuits that we have filed say this, that they actually have allowed it to happen because they're not able to take an action against the guru. So in my experience, in being both an outside counsel to corporations and also an investigator, and also someone who taught HR people how to investigate, the kind of things that Harvey Weinstein was doing are not happening in every corporation. Harvey Weinstein, like the cults, had ultimate power.
Yep.
And you don't see that in every corporation or business.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? You don't
Yeah.
see that. For example, I remember when I was working as a lawyer in Boston, something happened at a big corporation where the CEO was having sex with his secretary. It might have been consensual, but he stepped down.
Right.
Even if it was consensual, it was the appearance of it. I believe that Bill Gates had some kind of incident with his board where he was either admonished
Yeah.
or had some kind of, I don't want to say punishment, but something punitive that happened to him.
Some new information tonight surrounding Bill Gates' resignation.
Right. Well, I mean, we just saw this with Vince McMahon of WWE as well, and he actually stepped away. Like he had to resign from the company. I mean, this is someone who his father owned the company. You're talking about decades and decades and decades of total ownership and control, and now he's gone. They signed this giant deal with, I think, Endeavor, or and kind of combined with the UFC. So, and this stuff all just started coming out. Harvey Weinstein was actually sued earlier this year and accused of sex trafficking. Is that the same as human trafficking, or is there a difference between sex trafficking and human trafficking?
I think that you could think of human trafficking as the umbrella term.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two parts to it. One is labor and one is sex.
Okay.
So kind of traditional human traffic is bringing women into a situation where they are forced, coerced into sex. And the other is bringing people into a forced labor situation where they are held almost prisoner, almost as slaves.
Okay.
But they are both human trafficking, one for one purpose, one for the other.
Okay. And in this specific case, do you think human trafficking, absolutely, this qualifies for it and there's a case to be made for it? I know we just briefly touched on the P. Diddy stuff and things are coming out more about that now. It sounds like something similar there may come up in terms of just a lot of the same things you were describing: total control, quid pro quo.
More potential legal troubles for Sean Diddy Combs after another woman accused him of sexual violence.
Fox's CB Cotton is in New York with details.
In 1 week, 3 women have spoken out against Sean Diddy Combs, alleging he subjected them to violence. The latest accuser, April Lampros, filed a lawsuit in New York State Supreme Court saying she was a college student in the 90s studying fashion when Diddy promised industry access and mentorship. Instead, she alleges he sexually assaulted her 4 times.
I'm assuming we're going to kind of hear more and more about this in the coming weeks and months with these cases.
I would think so. And I want to point out, and because of exactly what you've said, which is when a person has total control, whether that's in a business, whether that's in a rap star's business, whether it's in a high demand spiritual community, it's often coercion. And if you look at how it's applied to Harvey Weinstein, which is have sex with me and I will further your career. Then you could see that that has a lot of implications in the entertainment industry. And it has the Trafficking Act for plaintiffs it does not involve consent, which is often a problem in straight sexual assault cases. The defendant is going to say she consented. And consent is not a defense in human trafficking. The other thing with the Human Trafficking Act is that it has a 10-year statute of limitations. So if I'm not mistaken, the P. Diddy case, came in under a New York, what I would call a revival window. So the way that works is there's a statute of limitations during which time you can bring your sexual assault case. And until recently, many of them have been punitively short, because what we know is that it takes a long time for people to come to grips in the aftermath of sexual assault. It takes a long time for people to come forward when the sexual assault has been from a trusted, maybe spiritual or religious advisor. And so these statutes of limitations were punitive to people, because when they finally processed this psychologically, it was too late to bring a claim. New York opened up that statute of limitations to any historical claims.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I have claims that go back to 1969.
Wow. That's great. That's
And so I think that's one of the things that you're seeing. And it's one of the reasons why, for example, a state might have a statute of limitations for sexual assault of 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. Human Trafficking Act, 10 years. So it's better. And now President Biden signed into law, I think a couple of years ago, that for children under the Human Trafficking Act, there is no statute of limitations.
That's a good thing.
In Canada, there is no statute of limitations on sexual assault. So from my perspective, that's where I would like to see the law go, where there are bigger open times for people to come to grips with what's happened and come forward.
Yeah.
Particularly in religious communities, I can't tell you, Dan, how many people, how many women say to me, I did not know that I was raped. Because what happened was shrouded in some kind of spiritual experience.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's it's a lot. It's a lot to process and a lot to sort of chew on. Obviously, we're in a new era, I think, of awareness that we probably didn't experience even 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, and certainly not before that. It took a long time to kind of come to grips with a lot of these just, what really are assaults and things that need to be kind of brought to the forefront. What brought you to the field of sexual misconduct cases in the beginning? Like, what drew you into this field? How did you first sort of find yourself working on these kinds of cases?
Yeah. When I think I was working in a law firm in Boston, and I was working in a group that did what was called institutional finance. And after doing that for a year or two, I figured out that I did not have any idea what institutional finance was actually doing. And so someone who worked in the employment law group said, hey, we're getting more and more cases, because this was in the early 90s when this was starting. Discrimination and harassment were starting to be in that first wave. And would you like to join our group? And I thought, well, I think I'll be able to understand that. People get fired. They get fired for okay reasons. They get fired for bad reasons.
Right.
But I can understand that. I was involved in things that had words like a triple, a double back mortgage, which I thought I will never understand
Right.
what it is. And so I'm going to go to something where I actually have some experience, and that is employment law. And very shortly after that, we began in that first wave that I spoke about sexual harassment. And then I began to expand my practice into training so that people wouldn't experience sexual harassment in the workplace or sexual misconduct, and then into investigations.
Okay. When you have been investigating these religious organizations, the cults, what's the process been like when you kind of first start? How are you alerted to this? With the Shambhala, I think, was the first one. And then we said the Shivananda as well. How did you kind of come across them, and what did that process look like in terms of investigating?
Yeah. So the first thing is that people found me. So I don't think I ever found anybody, but because I think the story about Shambhala was on the front page of the New York Times at some point, then a lot of people read that. There was a lot of media in Canada as well. And so I think while I was still involved in Shambhala, somebody who had been one of the women who came forward there had told another Lama, a woman Lama teacher, Buddhist teacher, about what I was doing. And she had 3 or 4 other people. And it kind of grew like that. It was organic. It was word of mouth.
Okay.
What I would do, and what I still do, is I listen to the stories of the women who come forward, because they have been, in most cases, silenced their communities. And so I feel like the most important thing is that for people to listen
Right.
and let them tell their story. And then what I feel like I do is, and not just me, I now have a whole team of lawyers and legal analysts who do the same thing. We hold those stories for those women because we have the ability to bring a lawsuit on their behalf. So we look into it. We say, who else would know about this? And so in the older cases, we actually have people who were active in the community. And when all of these rumors and things about sexual assaults came out, they've left and they help us to investigate. They say, you should talk to this person because this person might have known about this. And so we just begin pulling on a thread to see if we can find out who knew.
Yeah. And when this is kind of probably a difficult question, but in your opinion, When would you start considering an organization a cult? What is the crossing of the line into cult? How would you define that?
Yeah, I don't think that even the people who are experts on cults are exactly able to define it. And
Yeah.
of course, from my perspective,
Yeah.
and I will answer your question,
No,
Dan, but
absolutely.
from my perspective, I don't really care.
Right.
I don't care. I don't feel like I need to put a label on these people. If they
Mhm.
are sexually assaulting, if they are engaged in sexual violence and
Right.
it's endorsed or allowed or
Yeah.
overlooked by the organization, then I don't care whether they're a cult or not.
Yeah.
They're violating the law my view, and they need to be held accountable. I think that for the experts in cults, which I am not, but I think that a leader who has absolute power is one of the markers of a cult. I
Mhm.
think that there are many markers of coercion.
Right.
So coercion could be as simple as we all have to dress the same way. There's a taking away of individuality.
Mm.
One is not allowed to have one's own opinion. One must rely on the guru or the swami or the leader, whatever that person's title may be, for life decisions that normally those of us who are adults would be making on our own. We are told who we can be friends with, what we should do with our lives, who we can marry. All of those things to me are markers of perhaps cults. And I don't know where it is that they cross the line, because my line is pretty simple,
Yeah.
actually, right?
Yeah.
So
Thank you so much for everything today, Carol. This was really enlightening, to use a not to use a
spiritual word, yes.
exactly. That's very funny, but no, seriously, this was really very interesting. I appreciate your take on this so much. You obviously have just such a wide, breadth of expertise in this area, and thank you for being on Unshut Cases today. We hope to have you back as soon as possible.
I would love that. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Carol.